How do nations fight without firing a shot? The answer lies in a system so powerful, so invisible, that most people never even realize it's happening. Welcome back, and here is what I mean by that. In 2019, the United States imposed comprehensive sanctions on Iran. These weren't gentle restrictions. They were designed to strangle the Iranian economy. Oil exports dropped by 90%. The currency collapsed. The economy contracted by nearly 5%. And it all happened without a single shot being fired. No tanks rolled in. No soldiers landed on beaches. But the impact on ordinary Iranians was devastating. Inflation hit 40%. Medicine became scarce. Hospitals struggled to function. This is the reality of sanctions. They're supposed to target government behavior, but they inevitably hurt regular people. And that's the moral complexity we need to grapple with. But sanctions aren't always this severe, and they're not always used by just one country. Sometimes they're multilateral. Sometimes they're targeted at specific sectors. Sometimes they're designed to be reversible if the target country changes its behavior. The European Union has used sanctions extensively. So has the United Nations. Japan has imposed sanctions. South Korea has imposed sanctions. It's become a standard tool in the toolkit of international relations. Now, here is the thing about economic sanctions that most people don't understand. They're incredibly complex. They involve freezing assets. They involve banning imports and exports. They involve cutting off access to financial systems. They involve restricting technology transfer. They involve preventing companies from doing business. Each of these mechanisms works differently. Each has different effects, and when you layer them all together, you create an economic stranglehold that's nearly impossible to escape. But do they actually work? That's the question that economists and policymakers have been debating for decades, and the answer is complicated. Sometimes sanctions achieve their stated objectives. Sometimes they fail completely. Sometimes they achieve the opposite of what was intended. Let me give you some examples. When the United States sanctioned South Africa during apartheid, it contributed to international pressure that helped end the regime. That's often cited as a success. But when the United States sanctioned Cuba for decades, the regime remained in power, and the Cuban people suffered tremendously. That's often cited as a failure. When the international community sanctioned Libya in the 1990s, the government eventually complied with demands to hand over suspects in a bombing case. But when sanctions were imposed on North Korea, the regime doubled down on its nuclear program. The outcomes vary wildly, depending on context. Success depends on so many factors. It depends on the target country's economy, its political structure, its international relationships, and its leadership's willingness to change. It depends on whether there's consensus among sanctioning nations. It depends on whether the sanctioned country has alternatives, and it depends on whether the sanctions are designed with a clear exit strategy. When all these factors align, sanctions can work. When they don't, sanctions can be counterproductive. They can entrench opposition. They can create nationalist sentiment. They can actually strengthen the very regime you're trying to weaken. Here's a specific example that illustrates this perfectly. In 1991, the United Nations imposed comprehensive sanctions on Iraq, following the invasion of Kuwait. These sanctions lasted for 13 years. According to the United Nations, they contributed to the deaths of an estimated 500,000 children due to malnutrition and lack of medical supplies. The sanctions devastated the Iraqi economy and the Iraqi people. But did they change the behavior of Saddam Hussein's government? No. The regime remained in power until a military invasion in 2003. The sanctions failed to achieve their objective, but they succeeded in creating immense human suffering. This is one of the most controversial examples in the history of sanctions. It raised serious questions about whether such broad, indiscriminate sanctions are morally defensible, even if they're technically legal under international law. Many policymakers and humanitarian organizations now point to Iraq as a cautionary tale about the dangers of comprehensive sanctions regimes. What's particularly striking is that the Iraq sanctions regime was different from earlier sanctions. It was comprehensive. It targeted the entire economy, not just specific sectors. This approach was supposed to be more effective because it would put maximum pressure on the government. But what actually happened was the opposite. The comprehensive nature of the sanctions made them less effective at changing government behavior. Instead, they created a humanitarian crisis. Ordinary Iraqis bore the cost, while Saddam Hussein's inner circle found ways to profit from the black market that emerged. The regime even used the sanctions as propaganda, blaming the West for Iraqi suffering rather than blaming itself. This is a crucial lesson about how sanctions can backfire when they're too broad and too indiscriminate. If you're interested in understanding the hidden systems of power that shape our world, you need to subscribe to this channel right now, because we dive deep into these topics every single week. We show you how the world actually works, not how it's presented to you in the mainstream media. So hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you don't miss a single video, and let's continue this conversation about how economic power shapes global politics. Now let's zoom out across the global landscape and look at the bigger picture of how sanctions fit into modern geopolitics. The sanctions regime is asymmetrical. Wealthy nations with control over global finance can impose sanctions. Poorer nations cannot. The United States can sanction almost anyone. Iran cannot sanction the United States in any meaningful way. This creates a power imbalance that shapes international relations. It's a form of structural power. It's invisible because most of us don't see it, but it's everywhere. And this is where it gets interesting. Countries being sanctioned are starting to develop workarounds. Russia has been heavily sanctioned by Western nations since 2014. So Russia has been building alternative financial systems. They've been increasing trade with China and other non-Western countries. They've been developing their own payment systems to reduce reliance on the dollar. China has been doing the same thing. These nations are trying to create a multipolar financial world where no single country has the power to sanction them into submission. It's a fascinating geopolitical chess game playing out right now. The sanctions regime is also becoming more sophisticated. It's not just about trade anymore, it's about technology. When the United States sanctioned Huawei in 2019, it wasn't just restricting trade. It was restricting access to advanced semiconductors, cutting-edge software, and critical technology. The ban prevented Huawei from purchasing chips from companies like Qualcomm, and prevented it from using Google's Android operating system in its phones. This kind of technology sanction can be even more devastating than traditional trade sanctions, because technology is the foundation of modern economies. Companies can't function without it. Governments can't operate without it. And if you control the technology, you control the future. Think about what happened to Huawei. In 2018, before the sanctions, Huawei was the second largest smartphone manufacturer in the world. By 2021, after the sanctions had been in effect for 2 years, Huawei's smartphone market share had collapsed from 15% globally to just 4%. The company lost hundreds of billions of dollars in value. But here's the counterintuitive part. The sanctions didn't change Huawei's behavior or China's behavior. Instead, they accelerated China's efforts to develop its own technology infrastructure independent of American companies. China poured billions into developing its own semiconductors, its own operating systems, and its own supply chains. So the sanctions achieved the opposite of what was intended. They pushed China to become more self-sufficient and more competitive in the long run. This is a perfect example of how sanctions can backfire. When you push a country too hard, when you try to isolate it completely, it has no choice but to develop alternatives. And those alternatives can eventually become competitive with your own technology. The Huawei case is particularly instructive because it shows how technology sanctions can trigger long-term strategic shifts. Before 2019, China was heavily dependent on Western technology. American companies dominated in semiconductors, software, and advanced manufacturing. But the Huawei sanctions created an urgent national security imperative for China. The government began massive investments in domestic semiconductor companies like SMIC and Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation. They poured funding into developing their own operating systems and software ecosystems. By 2023, China had become the world's largest semiconductor market by sales, and domestic Chinese companies were starting to produce competitive alternatives to Western chips. This is a cause and effect that policymakers didn't anticipate. They thought sanctions would weaken China. Instead, the sanctions accelerated China's technological independence. Sanctions also have unintended consequences that policymakers often don't anticipate. When you sanction a country, you're not just affecting the government. You're affecting businesses, workers, and ordinary people. You're affecting supply chains that span the globe. You're affecting prices for consumers in the sanctioning country itself. When the United States sanctioned Russian oil following the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, oil prices went up globally. This contributed to inflation in the United States and Europe. So Americans and Europeans ended up paying higher prices at the pump because of sanctions on Russia. Gas prices in the United States hit record highs in June 2022, reaching an average of $5.16 per gallon. This was partly due to sanctions on Russian oil. That's an unintended consequence. It's a cost borne by the very people who supposedly benefit from the sanctions. And this is why sanctions are politically controversial. They sound good in theory, but in practice, they create winners and losers. Businesses that rely on trade with the sanctioned country suffer. Workers lose jobs. Prices go up for consumers. And these costs are often borne by ordinary people, while the political elites who impose the sanctions face no consequences. This is the hidden cost of the sanctions regime. It's rarely discussed, but it's very real. There's also the question of whether sanctions violate international law or principles of national sovereignty. Some argue that sanctions are a form of economic coercion that violates the principle that nations should be free to determine their own affairs. Others argue that sanctions are a legitimate tool of international relations. The legal and ethical status of sanctions is contested. But what's clear is that sanctions are a form of power, and power always raises ethical questions. Now, let me talk about the future of sanctions. As the world becomes more multipolar, as countries develop alternatives to the Western financial system, the effectiveness of sanctions imposed by the United States and Europe may decline. China is developing the digital yuan, a digital currency that could challenge the dominance of the dollar. Russia and China are building alternative payment systems like SPFS, the System for Transfer of Financial Messages. India is developing its own financial infrastructure. These developments suggest that the era of unilateral Western sanctions may be coming to an end. But this doesn't mean sanctions will disappear. It means they'll become more multilateral, more targeted, and potentially more effective because they'll require broader consensus. It also means that countries will develop more sophisticated ways to evade sanctions. They'll use cryptocurrency, shell companies, and complex trade networks to circumvent restrictions. The cat-and-mouse game between sanctioning powers and sanctioned countries will continue. It'll just become more complex. The sanctions regime is also becoming more ideological. In the past, sanctions were primarily imposed for security reasons. A country was developing nuclear armaments, so it got sanctioned. A country was invading another country, so it got sanctioned. But increasingly, sanctions are being used for ideological reasons. Environmental concerns, human rights concerns, labor standards. These are becoming reasons for sanctions. This is a shift in how sanctions are used. It's expanding their scope and their application. It's also making them more controversial because different countries have different values and priorities. What one country sees as a legitimate reason for sanctions, another country sees as interference in internal affairs. This is creating tension in the international system. It's creating conflict over who has the right to impose sanctions and on what grounds. The future of the sanctions regime will be shaped by these debates. It'll be shaped by technological change, by the rise of new powers, and by evolving norms about what constitutes legitimate use of economic power. Understanding sanctions is understanding one of the most important hidden systems of power in our world. It's understanding how nations influence each other without firing a shot. It's understanding the invisible architecture that shapes geopolitics. And if you want to stay ahead of the curve, if you want to understand the world as it really is, you need to understand sanctions. You need to understand how economic power translates into political power. You need to understand how the global financial system can be weaponized. This knowledge gives you an edge. It helps you understand news stories that seem confusing. It helps you understand why certain countries behave the way they do. It helps you understand your own economic situation and why prices are rising or falling. So keep watching our channel. Keep learning about these hidden systems. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how the world actually works. and let me know in the comments what aspect of sanctions you'd like us to dive deeper into next. Should we explore the sanctions on specific countries? Should we explore the technology behind sanctions enforcement? Should we explore alternatives to sanctions? Let me know, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new video. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.